Welcome to chapter 29, adjectival participles. Up until this point, we have learned present participles and aorist participles, but we have looked at present and aorist participles that are always adverbial. In chapter 29, we're going to look at present and aorist participles that are adjectival, not adverbial. Now remember, participles are verbal adjectives. So they can have adverbial uses and they can have adjectival uses. So what we're doing in chapter 29 is looking at the second half of that and looking at their adjectival function. We've actually seen bits and pieces of it already, haven't we? Even if a participle is adverbial, it's still agreeing with some word and case, number, and gender and that kind of stuff. But some participles are used with much more emphasis on their adjectival function, and that's what we're going to look at today. Now, I know I tend to play this card quite a bit, maybe too much, but yes, I do. Okay, all right. There's really not that much more to learn here. In other words, there's no differences in form. In other words, if akuon is adverbial or adjectival, it's still going to be akuon. There's no difference in the form of the participle. There's no difference in terms of aspect. A continuous participle is continuous, whether it's adverbial or adjectival, and it's equally difficult to bring out the aspect in English, whether it's adverbial or adjectival. But aspect is still the same. And actually, if you're up on your adjectival grammar, and you should be, what you're going to see that adjectival participles is just like their adjectives. Well, almost just like their adjectives. So a little bit of grammar, but no new forms. So let's review a couple of things on adjectival grammar. What's the definition of an attributive adjective? An attributive adjective is an adjective that is giving an attribute to a noun. It's attributing something about it. And what's the clue in context that an adjective is functioning as an attributive? Right, it's preceded by an article. And you have the first and the second attributive positions. And so if you have hey gune, hey agathe, Eston, and the rest of the sentence, you can tell that agathe is an attributive adjective. It's in the second attributive position, and it must be telling you something about the preceding noun. Now, in an attributive adjective, what determines the case, number, and gender of an attributive adjective? Yeah, the word they modify. Okay, nothing unusual there. And so how do you translate them? Well, you just find a way in English to take the adjective and make it modify the noun. What if you have hey agathe sothesatai? Well, you have an adjective, it's preceded by an article, but what's different in this construction? Right, there's nothing for it to modify. It's preceded by the article, but there's nothing for it to modify, and so the adjective must be functioning as a noun. Now, when an adjective functions as a noun, what determines its case? Use in a sentence, right. What determines its gender and number? Yeah, what it stands for, right. Okay, nothing new there. How do you translate a substantival adjective? Well, that's a little tricky, isn't it? You got to kind of look and see what it says in Greek, what it means in Greek. You look at its gender, you look at its number, look what it stands for. And sometimes you have to add a few words or so to make sense out of it, right? The good will be saved. Or in this case, perhaps because it's feminine, the good women will be saved, or whatever the agathe is referring back to, right? But you have some freedom when an adjective is used substantively in how you translate it. Okay, let's change the first illustration just a little. Let's say you have hey gune, hey akusa. Now akusa is what? Okay, it's a present active participle, nominative singular feminine, from akuo, meaning hearing, right? But when you look at this, how is this participle functioning? Yeah, you'll notice the adverbials never have an article in front of them. Did you notice that? I think I mentioned it briefly. But here you have article, noun, article, modifier, right? Now, modifiers can be adjectives, they can be prepositional phrases, they can also be participles. What I'm trying to show you is that this use of the participle fits right into your adjectival grammar. There's nothing surprising about this. So here you have a participle preceded by the article. It's an attributive position. It's functioning as an attributive adjective. In this situation, what's going to determine the case number and gender of the participle? What it modifies, just like an attributive adjective, right? So how do you think you're going to translate this? Well, you're going to have to look at it and see what does this say in Greek, and then how do I say this in English? And it's the woman, the hearing. How do you say that in English? The hearing woman, or the woman who hears. You'll find that's pretty common. And what happens on these things is if you get stuck, the first time you do is just translate the participle with an ing. Get it into your head, get the sentence translated, make sure you understand the relationships between words. And then you simply say, how do I say this in English? And what will often happen is that the participle will be translated as some kind of relative clause, or perhaps some other kind of clause. The hearing woman, the woman who hears. This is one reason why I taught adjectives the way I did, because I wanted you to move smoothly into participles. So here you have an attributive participle functioning as a normal adjective, case number and gender determined by the word it modifies. Ha pistuon sulfacetai. Okay, there's your participle, right? Pistuon, present active participle, nominative masculine singular. Why is it nominative? Well, it could be the subject, right? Now, if that were an adjective, how would you translate it? Let's say pistion is an adjective that means faith. Right, you would say the faith or the faithful one or the faithful person or something like that, right? Well, this is a participle. It's functioning as a substantival adjective, right? It's got the article. There's nothing for it to modify. And so you're going to have to do the same thing with participles that you have to do with adjectives when they're functioning substantively. You look and see what it means in Greek, and then you say, how do I say the same thing in English? You have ha pistion, there's your subject of the sentence, the participial phrase. Therefore, its case is determined, just like an adjective, by its function. It's a subject. Its gender number is determined, same way, by what it stands for. How are you going to translate it? Well, you're going to see what it says in Greek and then say the same thing in English. And if you had to be flexible with the uses of adjectives when they're functioning substantively, you have to be even more flexible with participles. So somebody make a stab at how you would do this. Yeah, the believing one will be saved. See, the believing one, pistion is singular, so you say one, not ones. The one who believes. He who believes. Something like that, which fits the context. What I want you to see is that it's behaving just like an adjective. And so think of your adjectival grammar and then switch over, and because it's a participle, and you can translate these things pretty straight out. The one who believes will be saved. Participles are verbal adjectives. When their adjectival side is being emphasized, you just fall right back into your adjectival grammar and you can translate them, okay? The situation you find yourself in at this point then is that when you see a participle, it will either be adverbial or adjectival. And if it's adjectival, just like any adjective, it can be an attributive adjective or it can be a substantival adjective, right? So you have to be aware of that most basic distinction with participles. And you have to ask yourself, is this adverbial or is it adjectival? What are the clues to help you know which is which? Well, one of the biggest clues is the article. An adverbial participle must be an arthrous. So if you see a participle and it does not have an article, it probably is adverbial. Attributive participles usually have an article. Or to state it the other way around, if the participle has an article, it can't be adverbial. It has to be adjectival of some sort. What I'm trying to do is simplify it, because the basic distinction is whether the participle is adverbial or adjectival. If it's adjectival, then all your adjective grammar should kick in, and you recognize that adjectives can either be attributive or substantival. Okay, now I stated things both directions. Let me say it again. You need to latch on to one way that makes sense. Adverbial participles must be anarthrous. Adjectival participles normally are articular. If you want to flip it around, if you see a participle that is anarthrous, it probably is adverbial. If you see a participle that has the article, it can't be adverbial, it must be adjectival. Now, I'm using grammatical language because it's the most concise way to do it. And so you need to sit and sift through that and think, make sure it's all clear in your head. The tricky part is when there's no articles anywhere. If you have a noun and you have a participle and some other stuff, you're just going to have to use context to decide how the participle is functioning. But what you'll do, you'll be translating along and you see a participle. Figure out what the word means. You may want to just stick an ing on your translation. But then you have to decide more specifically what that participle is doing. If it's anarthrous, and especially if it's at the beginning of the sentence, you're probably adverbial. If it has the article, it has to be adjectival.